Famous in a Small Town is about the family you're born with and the family you choose.
This is a story that follows two very different women from two very different eras.
Missouri native Wade Rouse writes about fierce, independent women, much like his grandmother, Viola Shipman, whose name he uses to pen his novels.
Yeah, my grandmother was everything to me growing up. She was my friend. And there was something that resonated because I saw how poorly she was treated often in our little town. And so this is my thank you to her.
With a wink and a nod to Missouri's Mark Twain, Rouse's newest novel features St. Louis schoolteacher Becky Thatcher and familiar landmarks of his former hometown. Why did you feel strongly about making St. Louis a centerpiece with your main characters?
I say every single novel I write is a love letter to a place that I love. So I'm a writer that has to come from a wellspring of inspiration, and setting is a huge part of that. You know, I like setting to be as big a character as my characters in my books. St. Louis is one of them, Michigan is one of them.
Becky and her BFF flee the big city to spend a summer in northern Michigan. Becky encounters an older woman who owns a general store.
Cherry Mary Jackson, who's an 80-year-old owner of the Very Cherry General Store in northern Michigan, and at the age of 15, she illegally enters Michigan's cherry pit spitting championship and spits that pit further than any of the other men, and also enters the Guinness Book of World Record, which makes her famous in her small town, but often not loved or appreciated.
A humorous day of drinking leads Becky to discover she has the same quirky talent as Cherry Mary, creating a friendship that changes both their lives.
And this is a book truly about, I think, rediscovering the magic of summer and the magic that lives within each of us if we just can see it.
Wade Rouse, welcome back to St. Louis.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Brentwood was home for like 20 years?
20 years. I was born and raised in Missouri in the Ozarks, and then, as you know, St. Louis is kind of the big city that I think rural Missourians want to migrate to. So moved here and had a long career here.
Right, and you did public relations back in the day?
I did public relations for a lot of colleges, universities, private schools, and lived in Brentwood in a little bungalow that was adorable that we still drive by every time we come back just to see how it's changed. And yeah, it was one of those first cottages that when people lived in the city, that they came out kind of into the suburbs back in the day to enjoy summer and some fresh air. So.
And you use the correct terminology, because we do call them bungalows here, because when I moved here at St. Louis Hills, they call it bungalow. I'm like, oh, okay, not a house, it's a bungalow.
It's a bungalow.
Yes.
And it has that history. And so St. Louis is, I always say I live in Michigan, but St. Louis and Missouri owns a piece of my soul.
So this story really is about the family you're born with and the family you choose. And Cherry Mary, so let's start with that. Please set the stage for us without revealing too much.
Yeah, this is a story that follows two very different women from two very different eras. One is Cherry Mary Jackson, who's an 80-year-old owner of the Very Cherry General Store in northern Michigan, and at the age of 15, she illegally enters Michigan's cherry pit spitting championship and spits that pit further than any of the other men, and also enters the Guinness Book of World Record, which makes her famous in her small town, but often not loved or appreciated. And she lives much of her life not by societal rules, and pays a little bit of a price for that. And she's always believed, she's the third generation that's owned this general store, she's always believed that it will be a woman that comes along in her lifetime that will take over her store and also beat her cherry record. But she's had a son who's had a son, and she doesn't know at the age of 80 when that's going to happen. And along comes Becky Thatcher, a 40-year-old elementary school teacher from St. Louis, Missouri, who's only followed the rules of society and has nothing to show for it at the age of 40, and goes on a girls' trip with her best friend to northern Michigan, gets a little bit drunk, wanders up to that cherry pit spitting contest, and blows a pit further than Mary ever did. And Mary thinks, this is who I've waited for my entire life. And this is a book truly about, I think, rediscovering the magic of summer and the magic that lives within each of us if we just can see it.
And a little twist at the end, too. Because what I thought would happen didn't, so I
there's-
liked that.
Good. There's a big twist at the end. And interestingly, not plotting a book, the deeper I get into my characters, they kind of take me on their journey and they tell me what should happen. And I love that. I love this book. It's quirkier than I think some of my other novels, but I also think embodies a perfect summer read.
And now you call Michigan home as well.
Yeah.
And you've been there for quite a while, right?
Yeah.
But so you left the big city. Let's go back. Born in the Ozarks, and grandmother was there. We're going to get into her in a minute. So Ozarks to the big city, back to a small town. Let's talk about that little trifecta.
Yeah, it's a lot of turning in my life and in my career. I grew up in rural America in the 1970s. It was not easy for a gay kid to grow up where I did at that time. I felt like I had a target on my back because I always joke, I came out of my mother's womb dressed like this and looking like this. And it wasn't easy to be a sensitive kid that liked to write and liked to read. And so I kind of ran from that. I wanted to go to a big city as quickly as I could. And I love St. Louis, but I also wanted a change of career, and I felt like I needed a change of atmosphere for that as well. And Michigan offered that. I grew up going to a little log cabin in the Ozarks with my grandparents that my grandpa helped build. No indoor plumbing really at the time. We bathed in the creek, no telephone, no TV. And there was something beautifully nostalgic about that, and I found an old cottage in Michigan that kind of represented that, and it called to me. And that's where I started really my career as a writer, and it just seems very Thoreau-y in a way.
Yes.
So it has been a lot of turns, but I ran so long in my life that I didn't want to run anymore. I wanted to confront myself as honestly as I could, and I love so much of small town America. I love the community that I have, the friends that I have, the fact that you can walk in and get a seat because they know you at a restaurant even though it's busy. It's a resort town. But all of those things that I loved about growing up in rural America, I found again, but in the right light.
Right. So Viola Shipman is your pen name. Why have you used your grandmother's name as a pseudonym?
Yeah, my grandmother was everything to me growing up. Talking about having a target on my back growing up, my grandmother was the place, her house was the place I ran to. And she protected me and loved me fiercely and unconditionally and told me that it was okay to be different, it was okay to be unique, to be anything that I dreamed of. And, I always get emotional. But she was working poor. She was a seamstress. She stitched overalls at a local factory, truly until she couldn't stand straight. Never had 2 nickels to rub together. My grandpa, Shipman, was an ore miner. Hard work. And when that dried up in the Ozarks, he raked rocks off of farmers' fields so that they could till and plant. And the old story in our family goes was whenever they had a little extra change, like a quarter or a dime, even a penny, they would throw it into an old crock. If you remember those giant old crocks that we used to have, it was in their garage. And over many years, that got full. And they hauled it into the back of his pickup and took it to the community bank and started a college fund for my mother.
Wow.
And she was the first in our family to go to college. So I like to say that change changed our family's life. But my grandmother volunteered at the local library, even though she never finished high school. She pushed books in my hands. She taught me the importance of education and that she never had an option.
Right.
And she wanted me to have an option. Yeah. And she was an incredible Southern oral storyteller. She would start stories and ask me to continue them, and we went back and forth. I grew up at her hem and her apron in her kitchen. I did all the things boys weren't supposed to do in the Ozarks in the 70s, but I baked with her in her kitchen. Every night I did homework in her sewing room as she sewed after work. I went to the beauty parlor every Saturday with her and watched her get her hair did, put that glitter in it and spray it to the moon. Yeah. She taught Sunday school, and I went to church with her every single Sunday. She was my friend.
Right.
And there was something that resonated because I saw how poorly she was treated often in our little town. And so this is my thank you to her. People walk in, even 50 years when I'm gone, and they say my grandmother's name. I believe in this ripple effect of kindness. She was a good woman, and if you're good, you don't know the impact you have on others.
I love that. I love that. What an homage and tribute to her.
Thank you.
Forever, really, truly.
Forever.
Yes, and in such a loving way, because these are wonderful books to read. I mean, she would be proud, don't you think?
I think so. I think she, her cheeks would be flushed, but I think she would be. I hope she would be proud.
Yes, no question. So you've written several books under your given name as well. Is the distinction then fiction versus nonfiction? Your grandmother's Viola Shipman is more the fiction. Nonfiction is for instance, a memoir?
Yeah, I started my career actually as a memoirist, as a nonfiction writer, and wrote 4 memoirs before I switched to fiction. And, I grew up loving and reading Irma Bombeck and the Ozarks.
I know this, and I was so happy because I loved her too. Your Midwest suburban wife and syndicated columnist, for those who don't remember. But the wit, and your wit is very similar to her wit.
Thank you. That's a huge compliment.
Yes, I loved her. But go ahead, Irma Bombeck.
Yeah, I grew up reading her. She had a column named At Wit's End in the local paper, and my grandmother loved it, and my mother loved it, and they would laugh at the end of a hard week. And I always wanted to do that. I'm like, if I could do that, that would be amazing. So that's kind of how I started writing, was just in family stories in my own voice. I went to Northwestern, was a journalist and a magazine writer, and then sold my soul to public relations to get a little more cash. But I always wanted to write, and so when I did, I wrote about my life in the Ozarks growing up as a memoir in my own voice. I always say there are 2 very different types of books, but both come from one place, right here in my heart.
Yes, because you do this in Famous in a Small Town. Your wit comes through because you name one of the characters Becky Thatcher, and I thought, okay, he's from the Ozarks. I'm feeling he's channeling Mark Twain here somewhere. So is this, or is it based on someone you actually knew named Becky Thatcher? Or are you just trying to do the whole Hannibal, Missouri thing?
I was trying like an insidery Missouri joke, and I do love Twain. He's a huge influence on me as well. One of his favorite lines I love is about editing. He said, I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. But I kind of wanted to give winks and nods to Missouri in a way through the book, and I did that with Becky Thatcher, which is it's a corny name, but I like the kind of insider humor that it offers, and that she's kind of a little bit tortured by what her parents have done to her.
How good is your cherry pit spitting? I don't even call it.
I've tried. So there's an actual place in northern Michigan in a little town called Glen Arbor where this is partially set as well, called the Cherry Republic, and it's purveyors of all things cherries, and they have an Olympic-sized pit spitting arena, which I didn't realize until I went. And they give you cherries, and you eat the fruit and then spit it as far as you can. So I was on a book tour and wandered into Cherry Republic, perhaps after a glass of wine, and was shoving chocolate samples down my throat. And I saw that, and I wandered out and tried my hand at it. It didn't do too well, but growing up, I spit watermelon seeds with my grandparents. That was a thing we did.
Yeah.
And I started to get fascinated by why they had this. So did a little, as a journalist, started doing research and Googling the background of it. And it turns out that there is the founder of Cherry Republic's mother is named Mary, like the main character in the book, who I call Cherry Mary. And lore had it, she spit the pit the furthest ever in history in Michigan. And I did a little more research, and there actually is a Michigan cherry pit spitting competition, which is huge in the state. People come from all over and try to spit that pit the furthest. And my mind started working. That's how I get inspiration. I just thought about, what if a woman did that in an era and a time when women really weren't supposed to do something like that? So that kind of set everything in motion.
There's a heavy theme about women and not struggle. Well, yeah, struggles, dysfunctional families, you name it, it's all in there. Let me ask you this. How is it to write in the mind of a woman? Because you have to with these main characters. Nicholas Sparks kind of does it. I guess he does. But how is it for you? Are you channeling your grandmother? Are you channeling things that other people and relationships you've had with women, or what?
Yeah. That's a great question, very much so. And it's a question I take very, very seriously. You know, a man writing female characters talking about issues that are vital to women in their lives is something that I really do hold close to my heart. You know, I grew up with my mother, my grandmothers, my great aunts. I heard them tell stories of their lives that the men folk, as we said in the Ozarks, weren't privy to hear. Their struggles and how they made it to that point in their lives, how they survived through everything. I think as a gay man growing up, girls, best friends, women shared secrets with me that they didn't share much with other people as well. And those stories changed me because I feel like, in many ways, your stories are my stories. Oftentimes we're overlooked, we're put down, we're not expected to do the things we want to do. We're picked on, we're demeaned. And so I take those issues very, very seriously. And so each novel I write, like Famous in a Small Town, has that theme that I really want to bring to life and bring respect to. And my grandmother was, you know, much like Mary in the book, was not treated so well. So that was something that was important to me to write about.
It seems like you like second chances.
My whole life has been second chances. You know, I always say if you're an author, it's all about second chances. You know, I was not probably the easiest person at one time in my life. I was closeted. I was unhappy. I wanted to be a writer. I didn't think it was possible. I thought there was some golden key that was handed to authors in New York City that I would never be able to get. And you have to learn to believe in yourself at some point. You know, a second chance isn't just in romance. It could be with any aspect of your life. And so I love characters that are able to, at some point in their life, like I did, have clarity and ask themselves, am I happy? Is this where I want to be in my life? What can I do to change that? And sometimes they have to come in conflict with somebody else that shakes them, you know, by the shirt collar and makes them see that.
I love the dynamic between Becky and her best friend Q, and the repartee that they had between each other was fun. I could almost, not even barely knowing you, just hear you going through that with somebody else.
It's me.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I talk with my best friends. It's like a back and forth, quick. Yeah, she's inspired actually by a couple of people. One of our friends, Mike Isaacson, is actually head of the Muni here. So a little bit of an homage to that as well. And then one of our best friends actually grew up in St. Louis, now lives in California. She's a psych nurse, and her name's Monique. We call her Q. And we have that kind of relationship where it's always, we love each other, but a lot of the time it's like that. Yeah. Almost like a vaudeville back and forth.
It made me laugh out loud. Because I felt like I was there with them and that I would have laughed. It was very cute, especially when she gets all awkward. Yeah, that's cute. Do you like your novels being described as a good beach read? Ooh, I'm ruffling some feathers here.
You know, it's something I preach a lot about. You know, publishers have to sell books, so they break them into different genres to do that. I always, and this is odd to say, but you know, men write fiction, not like this, and it's called fiction, or it's called literary fiction. If I or a woman writes this type of book, which it's termed as women's fiction, or as a beach read, or as family fiction, rather than just being a novel. I get why they do that, but it always rankles me a little bit, and I know it does I have many friends that are authors that are women that feel the same way. It just seems on occasion a little bit
condescending,
less than it should be, because you don't have to write about war or
a crime novel
or murder to be serious. You know, I write about issues that impact you and me, all of us on a daily basis, how we get to the next day. And how is that not important?
Right. So well said. That's interesting perspective. Truly, a lot of the aspiring writers, but even readers, can appreciate that too. Truly. I think you're maybe a little bit pigeonholed with that description.
And it's interesting, my very first memoir I ever wrote was not categorized when you walked into a bookstore at the time in 2006 as a memoir. It was gender studies. So it's always been an odd play to me on how things have kind of worked.
So the memoir, was that the one about your father, your relationship with your father?
That was my first. Yeah, that was called Magic Season.
Yes.
But this was called America's Boy
that's
in
right,
2006. Yeah.
Gotcha. And Magic Season, while we're bringing it up, that is about your relationship with your father. It's at one point estranged, but it has to do with baseball.
It has to do, yeah.
It's St. Louis.
It's about my tumultuous relationship with my Ozarks father. We did not see eye to eye on anything, but our love of baseball and the St. Louis Cardinals always bonded us. He always would pat the couch, and I would take a seat, and we watched thousands of Cardinals games together, thousands. And when we couldn't talk about life or my life or his life, we talked about Lou Brock or Al Rabowski or Bob Forsch, Whitey Herzog, and that's what united us. I would say when you go to a game, you're probably sitting by people that you might not have a lot in common with, but you're rooting for something bigger than you are, and that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And our St. Louis viewers and readers will certainly understand that. You're a writing teacher as well, aren't you?
Yeah, teach writing workshops to aspiring and kind of established writers. So it's tough. It's one of the hardest things I do. I teach writing, but I think I'm part psychologist, because what I do with aspiring writers is shake them really hard to overcome fear. Because, like I said, you want to be a writer, and then you sit down and bad things happen from here to here. You think, it's going to stink what I'm writing. I'll never make a penny. Why am I wasting my time? I should get dinner on the table. The kids have to go to soccer practice. And so you give up, or you don't channel what calls to you. You have to channel a story that deeply calls to you. And a lot of writers start that way, but then they sit down and think, I got to make a quick buck. I'll do Harry Potter again, but with cats, or, Twilight with tan people, or whatever it is. And it doesn't work. So I always tell people, if you drop that fear that consumes you, that stops you, then really wonderful things can happen in your life and your writing.
Sure. I want to continue talking about that. I want to share with everyone that you were finalists for the Goodreads Choice Awards in Humor, lost to Tina Fey.
That's fixed.
And named by Writer's Digest as the #2 writer, dead or alive, we'd like to have drinks with. And you were right between Ernest Hemingway and Hunter S. Thompson. That ain't bad.
It's either a compliment or a curse. It says something about my drinking, I think.
Well, I want to talk about that, because are you still hosting your Thursday night Facebook Lives at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time?
Yeah, I do Wine and Words with Wade every 6:30 Eastern Time, and I have a glass of wine every single week. It's kind of like the wind down, but it kind of grew out of COVID when I had a book out and other authors did, and there was no way to promote it. And this is something that's continued for the last 3 years, and I interview authors, and we do office parties and dress up in costumes, and it's just an amazing way to connect with readers and kind of give them a glimpse behind the books.
Well, I thought we might do a happy hour right now with our Missouri wine.
The Missouri wine, as my dad would say.
While you give advice to budding writers.
Join me every Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern as I discuss books, writing, and inspiration, and welcome best-selling authors and publishing insiders as my special guests. I'm so glad you're here. So pour your beverage of choice and let's get down to it.
Well, here's to our happy hour here in St. Louis.
Cheers.
Cheers, and to welcome back again, Wade, and congratulations on Famous in a Small Town. Now, while you sip, I'm going to ask you more questions. So, in your writing process, establishing yourself as a memoirist, is that the correct word, and a novelist, what is the writing process? How different is it?
Similar, but very different. So I'm very regimented. Every day is kind of like a start at 6:30 in the morning. Memoir, I write differently than fiction. I write memoir in much more of what I call a puzzle piece style. So it could be, like, for instance, in Magic Season, writing about my father. I will typically start with a seminal moment that's deeply emotional, a scene that probably sets the tone for the rest of the book. And then I can move forward, I can move backward, I work very hard in memoir on structure. So Magic Season is structured around a baseball game. It's the very last game I ever watched with my father. It's the game between the Cards and the Cubs in the 2015 division championship, with the Cardinals lost, unfortunately. But it's inning by inning of that last game, but also back and forth through our life. I like in memoir to have a structure where I can hang my hat and go back and forth in time in a clever way. Fiction, I approach a little bit differently. I have to know my characters first. So I'm not really a plotter of a book. I don't like being that straitjacketed.
Yeah.
But I like knowing the characters I'm going to write about. So I do very in-depth character sketches on them. Got to know what they wear and how they talk and what their quirks are.
So even though you're in between books or at a book tour, you're on a book tour, and you happen to be having a little vino, and you see people enjoying their summer day, and I'm kind of jealous. That's how you found the place, the cherry.
That's exactly it.
So you found the place, and then how did the characters evolve from that?
This was a little bit of a backwards. Like I found the setting,
Okay.
I was there, and I'm like, ooh, this would be a great
Right.
setting for a book. And then spit that cherry pit, then started to do research about the founder's mother, who, lore had it, she spit that cherry pit the furthest it ever had been. Plus, I found out that she was also a woman during the 50s and 60s that took, kind of women that had been victims of domestic abuse or were down on their luck under her wing and sheltered them, which was not received that well in the tiny town. Much like my grandmother did. She used to take kind of what they used to call the town ne'er-do-wells to church with her or bringing them over to Sunday dinner, and people didn't like that. But that's kind of how that started. So yeah, I kind of started to do a lot of research, and that character came together. I thought, what if there was a woman that, entered this cherry pit spitting contest at a time when she wasn't allowed to do it, but that served as an analogy for kind of the straitjackets that are often placed on women and what they're expected and not expected to do. So that's how I did it. And then Becky kind of came from a little bit from myself, which was, I hit 40. I had a very good life and a very good career, but I was deeply unhappy because I had lived my entire life like Becky does, pleasing everybody else but herself. And kind of hits that mark with nothing to show for it. And she, used to go to northern Michigan from St. Louis with her grandparents, and she dreamed she could be anything she wanted. And what happens when adulthood kind of crowds out who we dreamed of being? It's not easy being an author. It's not easy doing what you do. It takes a lot of sacrifice and hard work. But sometimes we spend too much time pleasing those around us and wanting them to be happy, and it ends up making us not so.
What's a common question you get from folks who are looking for your advice or as your students?
One of the biggest things I think is how they get started. They don't believe in themselves. I go back to fear. They just don't. They have a story they want. I believe everybody has a story they want to tell. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily even have to be through writing a book. It could be a journalist.
Right.
It could be an artist. It could be as an attorney or a doctor. But they limit themselves and they get scared and they don't allow themselves to do that. And they start to doubt themselves, and really bad things happen when that occurs. So that's kind of the biggest thing. And the other is, I always tell people, you got to write. People sometimes think writing is, this muse that's, it's the way they depict it in movies and, for Sex and the City, it's, that angel sits here and talks to you, and that's not the way it is a lot of the time. It's just hard work. It's, it's sitting your tushy in a seat for a long time, and sometimes you get a page in 6 hours, and sometimes you get 10 pages. Right. But it's never stopping and never giving up and knowing you're going to be rejected. That's part of the business. Right. You're going to get told no. I get told no all the time now. But it's how do you overcome that?
All right. So that's where the psychology part comes in as the writing professor as well.
It is.
Yeah, I understand that. You also tell them to listen to your mentors.
I do.
Yeah.
You
did at least.
I always say, especially in writing, if there is someone you trust that is giving you sound advice, listen to it. Listen to what they're saying. If they don't like it, don't get upset. If they say change this, don't get upset. Take it to heart, because they're sometimes get a little too close to your work. And if you're, I would say, tell writers, if you're querying a literary agent, if a literary agent that's who you have to sell a book, if they reject you but they give you advice, either through a written note or an email, don't get huffy on that. Listen to what they say, because they're saying you have something there. And, kind of rework it. I would say the first draft of a book is the beginning. You got about 6 more to do.
To go through it. You did make it like a top 10 list of, what was this, for publishing?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the publish, and I went through that. It was very great. Because you use humor. Humor can be tricky, though, can't it?
Humor's the hardest thing to do in writing.
Yeah.
Irma Bombeck, going back, people think it's hard to make someone cry. It's easier for me, I think, to do. Humor, it's like if you tell a joke to a room full of people, half the room thinks you're hilarious, half the room thinks you suck.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to pull off, but I love humor, especially in fiction and nonfiction, because it's a way to lift people and bring them out of kind of harder topics. It's a way to pull people in, but also keep them back a little bit. It's the great uniter. I also think humor's a way to be totally honest as well.
Well, let's end on that. A toast to your wonderful writing, all your followers, to your Words and Wine with Wade on Thursdays, and to our happy hour today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for
Appreciate it.
having me.